I'd like to study it at least another year. I don't think you ever go wrong studying the life of Christ, and this is going to appear to be a kind of like a shotgun approach today, but it's by design. The lesson itself is designed that way because the Gospel of John is vastly different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels because they follow the same general timeline, and the pattern of the accounts and the miracles are pretty much the same. Some of the things are found in all three accounts, and some of them may be found in two. And then John's Gospel gets written about 40 years after those three Gospels, after the fall of Jerusalem and all of those things. And so John writes with a specific purpose. And a lot of what we're reading about here in these early chapters of John are things, for example, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but there are a lot of things that John talks about in considerable detail that Matthew just glossed over. Notice, he just made a kind of a general statement over about 3 or 4 verses, whereas John dedicates maybe 4 chapters to the thing that Matthew only dedicated 3 verses to. And all that goes back to the idea that Matthew was writing to a particular audience, obviously Jews, while John's writing for a particular purpose, and that is to show the deity of Jesus. And John focuses his gospel on 7 miracles of Jesus. And so some of the things that were not particularly important in detail to Matthew, John goes into considerable detail. Whereas Matthew might talk about dozens of miracles or lump together a multitude of miracles in a single verse. John deals with some of these things in particular detail. Now, I said we're going to start in verse 43, but let me just kind of throw this out. John 4:43 is actually a continuation from verse 3. All right? Now, just listen to me read it. All right? Therefore, when the Lord... I'm starting in John 4:1. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize with his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. Now, after the 2 days, he departed from there and went to Galilee, verse 43. You see, in other words, this whole section of Jesus in Samaria, a 2-day, which covers 2 days, all right? The woman at the well, and then the people who came to hear Jesus because of her testimony. It's almost like that whole thing is a parenthesis between verse 3 and verse 43. In other words, John focuses on this singular event, and then he jumps right back into Jesus to Galilee. Okay? Because he's talking about going to Galilee in verse 3, and then he goes to Galilee in verse 43. So everything from 4 to 42 is just a synopsis of a singular event that took place while Jesus was in Samaria. So John picks up back with his narrative that Jesus is going to Galilee. Now, John's going to start talking about a lot of different things here in John 4, 5, and 6 that Jesus did in Galilee. All right? But with that in mind, hold your mark there in John 4 and turn back to Matthew chapter 4. And look at verse 12. Matthew 4 verse 12 is what we find in John 4, 1 to 3. Now when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he departed to Galilee. And then Matthew doesn't say anything at all about Jesus even traveling through Samaria. Just says he left Judea and went to Galilee. Matthew doesn't even talk about Jesus being in Samaria. Number one, that would probably be a hindrance to his Jewish audience. The Jews don't want to hear about Jesus going through Samaria. The Jews don't want to hear about Jesus dealing with Samaritans. Matthew didn't want that. And look, I'm just speculating on this, right? But perhaps Matthew didn't mention this because he didn't want it to be a hindrance to the other things that he needed to tell his Jewish audience. He didn't want them to get all hung up. Sometimes it's like, I got two guys in my mind right now, okay? And I'm not going to tell you either one of them because you know one of them and you don't know the other. All right? But the other one might happen to be watching. All right? They're the two worst storytellers I've ever known in my life. Worst storytellers ever. They start telling you a story, and then they're going to give you like 60 million insignificant details about some person. You know, like he's going to tell a story, and then this person's involved in the story, and then he's going to tell you the life history of this person before he comes back to the story, about who all they're married to and where they worked and all. You know, totally irrelevant. In other words, a 5-minute story takes 45 minutes to tell. All right, and so Matthew doesn't tell this as a part of his story because he doesn't want the Jews to get hung up in their mind about Jesus being in Samaria and talking to a woman and all those things. So Matthew has a story to tell, and he's only going to tell the details that are helpful to his audience. All right. So I'm kind of explaining why accounts contain some things and not others. But verse 12 in Matthew 4 says Jesus enters into Galilee, by the way. And it doesn't talk about any specific miracle. Rather, instead, it talks about Jesus going to Galilee is a fulfillment of prophecy in verses 15 and 16. Then he calls the disciples in verses 18 to 22. And then you get to verse 22, and it says, "And Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease among the people. And his fame went throughout all Syria, you know, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, demon-possessed, epileptics, and he healed them." So in other words, Matthew just races through this section of Jesus in Galilee, whereas John takes a little time to start telling you some of the things that Matthew just told you in a single sentence. In other words, Jesus went about all Galilee. Well, John 4:43 is what happened in Matthew 4:23, just an expanded version of it. And so what we're going to do is, as we make our way through this lesson, I hope I can get through most of it today, if not all of it, I'm doing this to help you understand why we're jumping back and forth in between the texts. Matthew's not telling you anything specific about Galilee except that Jesus is working miracles and the multitudes are flocking to him, because Matthew is leading up to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Mark is going to tell us a little more about some of these things, whereas John tells us a lot more. But we're jumping back. But what you have to understand is, even when we're jumping back and forth from book to book, we're not jumping back and forth in time. We're just trying to gather up as best we can a synopsis, but a fairly detailed synopsis of everything Jesus did in Galilee. By the way, the ministry of Jesus in Galilee sometimes is overlooked because it starts in Matthew 4 and verse 12. And I kept reading this morning because I wasn't that familiar with the travels of Jesus at this time, in my mind. So I'm starting to read, and I'm like, man, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, all right, he's in Galilee. He's giving us a Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 8, he's still in Galilee. And then he goes across the sea to the land of the Gergesenes and heals a demoniac there, and turns right back around and goes to Galilee again. And in chapter 9, it's like he's still in Galilee. If you're not paying attention, you don't realize he has spent a lot of time in Galilee. And for good reason. That's the area that he knew best. It's the area where he was from. Capernaum, Nazareth. We're all in that northern part of what we call the Holy Land. All right, and so Jesus would naturally spend a lot of time there because that was his home area, but then obviously he has to spend time in Jerusalem because that's, for lack of a better term, it's the city of God, at least for the Jewish people at that time. And so that's kind of all of this in the introduction. So now let's go to John 4 and verse 46. Which is an account which is detailed to us also in Matthew chapter 8. It's in Matthew 8. It says, so Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee. Note there, Cana of Galilee. All right? Where he had made the water wine. So John is making a specific connection, reminding us Jesus is going back to the place where he performed his first miracle at the wedding feast. It says, and there was a certain nobleman, that is a royal official, whose son was sick at Capernaum. Right? Not far at all from Cana. And when he had heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Jesus said to him, unless you people see the signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. And the nobleman said to him, Sir, come down before my child dies. Jesus said to him, Go your way, your son lives. So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. And as he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, Your son lives. And he inquired of them the hour that he got better. And they said, Yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. So the father knew that that was the same hour in which Jesus said to him, Your son lives. And he himself believed, and his whole household. This, again, is the second sign Jesus did when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. Again, a great account, a great text here. And by the way, does it remind you of another event in the life of Jesus? Does healing this man's son remind you of another event in the life of Jesus? But I mean, if it doesn't, that's all right, because I'm going to tell you who it reminds me of. But you remember when a centurion came to Jesus and said, My servant is sick, he's fixing to die? And Jesus said, I will come and heal him. And the centurion said, Nope. I'm not worthy for you to come to my house. I'm not worthy for you to come into my house, Lord. Just say the word. Just say the word. And that's exactly what happened. So the stories are similar, except that Jesus didn't go to Capernaum and he said the word and he healed that man's son there. He was going to go to the centurion's house, and the centurion said, There's no need for you to go to all that trouble. Just say the word. It's good enough for me. And he healed that man's servant. All right. So what do we learn? What's one of the things we learn about Jesus early on? Because this is in the earliest days of his ministry now. He's just getting cranked up. All right. So what's he showing people? Compassion. Power. He's concerned. He has the power, and he exercises that power. But you think about all the healing. Normally, when we think about Jesus healing somebody, we might think about him, spitting on the ground and making clay and anointing a blind man's eyes, or in an account that we'll look at a little later this morning, Jesus touches a leper, and he's healed. We think about the woman with the issue of blood. She touches Jesus. We've studied in past weeks, people thronged Jesus just for the opportunity to touch him. If I just get close enough to touch him, I can be healed. And so we're finding an incredible demonstration of power. An incredible demonstration of power on the part of, sir? People were. It wasn't just that he was doing it. People were getting it. They were starting to get it. And that's why the multitudes began to follow him. Which also shows us, why was Jesus doing these miracles? Not just to be a show off. He's trying to get people's attention. Because he's got something that they need to hear. And so these miracles were done so that Jesus could gather a large enough group to preach to these people because he had a very limited time. He had a very limited time to do his work. And so, if you got to preach to a certain group of people and you have a limited amount of time, the bigger crowds you can gather up, the better off you are, right? In other words, Jesus didn't have time to go door to door and talk to every single person. So it's going to be better for him to preach in a much larger context. All right? And so the conclusion here of the second miracle is the lesson we learn is that Jesus has all power, so we can take him at his word. In other words, Jesus can be believed. Everything Jesus said is true, and everything that Jesus said about himself is true, and every promise that Jesus ever made can be believed and embraced. All right, now, going back to Matthew 4, in the bottom of the first page here on Lesson Plan 17, it says, Jesus, I love the way it says, Jesus sets up base in Capernaum. Capernaum. By the way, the name Capernaum means the city of Nahum. It's Capernaum. It means it's the city, it's the place of Nahum. It says Capernaum would be the base of his operations. From that time on, during his Galilean ministry, Jesus would never be gone long from Capernaum. And it's also from here that he calls they call them the full-time disciples. We'll talk a little bit more about the 12 going forward. Y'all hear that? I've never heard anybody say that before, and it is exactly right. Hear what he said? I know it doesn't get any louder than this, Your Honor. He says he spent a chapter in John 3 talking to a Pharisee. He spent nearly a chapter in John 4 talking to a Samaritan woman. And now at the end here of John chapter 4, he's dealing with either a Roman or a Herodian official, but quite possibly a Roman official. And Scott draws the conclusion or makes the point that from John 3 to John 4, Jesus addressed pretty much everybody there was to address in the world, for lack of a better, excuse the terminology, racially speaking. Okay? Because you have Jews, you have Gentiles, you have Samaritans. So from John 3 to the beginning of John 3, or from the beginning of John 3 to the end of John 4, Jesus has talked to Jewish officials at the highest level, Samaritans, and now the Gentiles. Which, by the way, we talked about, if we go back, I said we're going to go back to Matthew 4, 13 to 16. If you notice, what does the text say about Jesus? Galilee of the Gentiles. Galilee of the Gentiles. And so Jesus is fulfilling not only this passage, he's fulfilling what Simeon said about him when he was brought to the temple, that he would be a light to those who sat in darkness, speaking specifically to or of the Gentiles. Man, that's a great observation, Scott. that had never ever entered my mind, but that is absolutely spot on. All right, top of the next page. Top of the next page. Healing a demoniac in the synagogue. Now this is Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. And also Luke's account, but we'll stay in Mark's account just because of the way it's worded here. Verse 21 in Mark 1. Then they went into Capernaum. That's what we've been talking about. Jesus is setting up shop in Capernaum. And immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. By the way, look at verse 22 again. What does it say? He taught as one having authority and not as one of the scribes. Does that phrase sound familiar? Because it should. Yes, but there's one. I'm thinking, Bully. I'm thinking about almost a word for word text that goes with Mark 1:22. The last two verses of Matthew chapter 7, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, says, when he finished speaking, they were all astonished at his teaching, for he taught as one having authority and not as one of the scribes. Now, those are not parallel accounts. They're the same statement.
I take that as one who gives the word instead of writing it down.
Right. And the scribes would teach by referring to a previous authority. You know, look, just for example, obviously you would never want to do this, right? But people will do this. People will reference some well-known preacher or author to support their view. In other words, I have this view and Gus Nichols endorsed this view. So therefore, if Gus Nichols endorsed it, it's got to be right. Or I hold this view and Guy Woods holds this view, and if Guy Woods holds it, or if you're in Lamar County, somebody might say, VP Black taught this, and if VP Black taught it, that's good enough for me. Or if you went to Florence, somebody say, well, T.B. Larimore taught this, and he founded Mars Hill Bible School. In other words, appealing to what they perceive to be a higher or greater authority. Right? That's how the scribes would teach in the days of the first century. They would refer back to in their mind, great Jewish teachers. In other words, rather than referring back to the scripture, they would refer back to some great Jewish theologian and say, now the great rabbi such and such, this was his take on this text, and I believe that is right. All right? Now, Jesus didn't do that. See, there's the difference in Jesus' teaching. Jesus didn't say, you've heard that it is said of old, thou shalt not murder, just like the great rabbi says. That's not how Jesus taught. What did Jesus say? You've heard that it said to those of old time, you shall not commit murder. And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. This is Matthew 5, beginning about verse 21 or 22. It says, but I say to you, that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause is in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, or who is angry with his brother without a cause is in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, thou fool, shall be in danger of the council. And whoever says, Raka, shall be in danger of hellfire. You've heard this said to those of old time, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, whoever looks upon a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You see the difference there? Jesus said, here's what you heard. Here's what you've heard. And by the way, some of what they heard was right. Thou shalt not commit murder. I read that in a book somewhere. Thou shalt not commit adultery. I read that in a book somewhere. But Jesus said, but I say to you, over and over again in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, but I say to you, but I say to you. You've heard it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you. Jesus is invoking himself as the authority. He's not referring to, and nobody ever heard anybody teach like that. In other words, what man? Now look, we know Jesus was more than a man, right? We're all in agreement on that. But think about here comes a guy out of some insignificant area of the Jewish population, a man of no family, renown. He's a nobody, so to speak. And this guy comes out and he starts talking like he knows something.
They're all thinking, who talks like this?
Who in the world talks like this? By the way, you get to Matthew 13, and the Bible says, they're like, where did this guy get all this? It says, we know who his brothers and sisters are. Isn't he a carpenter's son? We know his brothers and sisters, and they ain't nothing. And what's the Bible say? They were offended because of him. No, they weren't offended by the fact that he wasn't telling them the truth. They were offended because they didn't believe he had the authority to say what he was saying the way that he said it. You see? And so Jesus is establishing himself as an authority, as a religious authority. All right? And so this healing of the demoniac, which follows the statement there in verse 22, that verses 23 through 28, he just simply casts out the unclean spirit. Verse 27 says, they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, what is this? What new doctrine is this? For with authority, there's that word again, with authority, he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. See there? They obey him. Now you think about it. A man had no power over an unclean spirit, right? In other words, if we were living in the first century, and an unclean spirit decided to set in on somebody, so to speak, even a child, you remember the man whose son had an unclean spirit? An ordinary man has no power over that unclean spirit. In other words, it's not like the unclean spirit knocks on the door, and says, unclean spirit here, pizza. You open the door. You're that sneaky unclean spirit. I'm not opening the door for you. Yeah.
You don't think Jesus intimidated them because he was doing things that they don't recall about?
Perhaps. I think obviously that has to be a part of it, because he's next level.
Well, he's 20, I guess.
Early around 30.
Elders that were so.
Yeah, think about it. Yeah, it's the 60-year-old guy. It's a group of 60-year-old guys looking at some young whippersnapper coming in here and just, blowing the place apart, and they don't understand it, and they don't have an answer for it.
These are the accounts that they're going to use against him.
Sir?
I said, and these are the accounts that they're later going to try to use against him.
Yeah, they're going to try to.
Be in league with the devil.
Yeah, he's in league with the devil. We get to Mark 3, and by the power of the devil, he casts out devils, and then he shows how stupid that statement is. All right, so then let's keep walking through here. Again, a matter of authority. Then healing Peter's mother-in-law. This is in Matthew chapter 8, immediately following the Sermon on the Mount. What's happening here? People still bringing sick folks to Jesus. Still bringing sick folks to Jesus. Just as an aside, the first pope was apparently married. Just throwing that out there. Now, obviously, I'm speaking in jest. Peter was married, but I'm not saying that he was the first pope. All right, or any pope. So we have now, he's healing Peter's mother, healing Peter's mother-in-law. Let's go down to the third paragraph. It says, Jesus' first teaching and healing tour. I like that. It's a tour. What do you mean a tour? Well, it just means he's traveling around. So, again, Matthew 4:23. Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, plural, preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease among the people. So Jesus is traveling around. He's going to all the synagogues. He's talking to as many of his Jewish brethren as possible. He's healing as many sick people as possible. It says he healed them all. He healed them. Everybody that was brought to Jesus, he healed them. In other words, and by the way, Matthew's little account there, says demon-possessed, epileptics, paralytics. He healed them all. In other words, it didn't matter what kind of problem they had. It didn't matter if they were demon-possessed. It didn't matter if they couldn't walk. It didn't matter if they had some type of neurological disorder. No matter what it was, Jesus could handle it. And by the way, when he healed the blind man, he did something that had never been done before. People have been raised from the dead before in the Old Testament. We can read about a number of those things, but Jesus started doing things that people recognize, hey, nobody ever did this before. Blind from birth, that's exactly right. So Jesus is doing things that have never been seen before. Raising the dead had been done before. Not that it wasn't an incredible thing to witness. It had been over 400 years since anybody had ever done that, but you could still read about it in the Old Testament. But Jesus is doing stuff for people that had never, ever been done before. And so he calls it his first teaching and healing tour. And then you get in the second paragraph under the in Galilee, the teaching and healing tour, it says, Jesus went to a secluded place to pray. In other words, Jesus was never so busy that he didn't take time to stop and pray. Now, here's the thing I want us to think about on this particular point is, Jesus spent all day, every day, traveling, teaching, and healing. I mean, from the time he got up till the time till the time the sun went down, Jesus was either traveling and or teaching and or healing, thronged by multitudes and multitudes of people. He had to be exhausted. He had to be exhausted. And yet, despite exhaustion, he still went out to a secluded place to pray. One thing I do every night, the last thing I do when I lay down at night is pray. And you know what? I usually fall asleep while I'm praying. I can't think of any better way to fall asleep. All right? But Jesus made sure he didn't fall asleep. In other words, he didn't lay down in his bed to pray. He went out into a deserted place, like in a mountain, to pray. In other words, I probably wouldn't fall asleep while I was praying, say, if I went out of my house and went down to the farm and found me a place to pray down at the farm, right? Or to go somewhere else, you see. So Jesus made sure he went at a time and place where he could pray and not be hindered, either by people or by exhaustion. And so I think it's just a great example for us there. All right, next Sunday we'll finish 17, and we'll do the questions, and hopefully I can try to make our way into lesson 18.